Hey, I'm Pastor Eli, and welcome. It's time for another Faith Friday. I haven't gotten to see you in a little bit, so I'm glad that you were able to meet me here as we strengthen our faith through reading the Word. I want to share with you a small passage from the book of Hebrews. Now, Hebrews is one of my favorite books. If you haven't had the chance to read it, please do. So Hebrews chapter 9, and I want to look at specifically verse 9. But before I tell you what's in verse 9, let me tell you how chapter 9 starts off. Paul, if you believe that Paul wrote Hebrews, he starts off by talking about how in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, there was a sanctuary that had the menorah, which is the candlesticks that people usually associate with Judaism. There was a table of showbread with the loaves of bread. And there were several other things in there, like the veil that was separating the most holy place from the holy place, and lots of other things. All of those things, according to Paul, as he's writing here in Hebrews, are the sanctuary, which in Greek is hagios, and sanctuary, of course, comes from the Latin, which is santos, which those of you who speak Spanish, santo, signifies the word holy. It's something that is holy or sacred, and that's exactly what the word hagios in Greek means. So all of those things were considered the holy thing, the holy place, not to be confused with the compartment of the holy place. We'll talk about that another time. That's for a Theology Thursday. Verse 9 comes in and he kind of wraps all of that up because he gives an explanation for what all those things did and how there was a priest that went through each one of those specific purposes. But then he gets to verse 9 and he says, all of these things were a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect, as pertaining to the conscience. In other words, he says all of those things were a pattern. They were like a shadow, depending on the translation there. I have the King James, but I also have the English Standard Version that I want to read for you a little bit here. It says, those things are symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. None of those things that they did in the Old Covenant were able to actually remove sin or actually make somebody right with God, because they were actually pointing forward to something, and that's the whole point of Hebrews. They were pointing forward to Jesus. How do we know that? Two reasons. The rest of this chapter and the rest of the whole book of Hebrews talks about how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Lamb. He's the fulfillment of the showbread, because he is the bread of life. He's the fulfillment of the menorah, because he is the light of the world. He's the fulfillment of everything in there and more. And on top of that, there's a story in the book of Luke. Luke chapter 24 has this iconic story of how there's two disciples walking home to Emmaus after Jesus had been crucified and then had been in the tomb, and now his body was missing. And they didn't know what to make of it. So they're walking back home. I highly recommend reading the story, as always. They're walking back home, or walking to Emmaus for that matter, and Jesus draws near to them while they're walking. Now, they don't realize that it's Jesus, so he comes over and pretends to be just a newcomer there in the area, and he says, so why are you guys so sad? And they're like, what? Are you the only person who doesn't know? There was this man named Jesus. He was a prophet, and he was crucified, and we thought that he was going to be the Messiah. And now we're really disappointed because we don't know where his body went. Some women say that he's been resurrected, but we don't know what to make of it. And Jesus tells them something. He says, you guys are a bunch of fools. Don't you know how to read the Bible? And so beginning at Moses and all of the prophets of the Old Testament, Jesus expounds, or he explains the whole thing from the beginning of Genesis all the way through the end, how all of those things spoke about him and the things that he was going to suffer through for the sake of the world. It's really cool because that sanctuary service, which was the central thematic piece of the Old Testament and the Old Covenant, all of that was not just a religion back then. It was supposed to be an example, a pointing forward to Jesus. There is one more thing, though, that I want to share with you for encouragement today, and that's how Paul, who writes here in Hebrews, who I believe writes Hebrews, he uses a very special word, a word that'll make you smile. When he said that those things were symbolic for the present age, or that they were a pattern, that word, that is a little Greek word that you're probably going to recognize almost immediately, is the Greek word parabole, which should sound awfully familiar. Because Jesus, whenever he told and taught the people, he would use parables. That word parables in the Greek it's actually the exact same word And we use that Greek word in English. It's a parable, like the parable of the sower, the parable of the wheat and the tares, the parable of the Good Samaritan. All of those parables are stories that carry significance within them. They're supposed to make it easier to understand some divine truth. Paul is telling us that in the Old Testament, in all of the Old Testament, the sanctuary services back then aren't obsolete to the point where we shouldn't look at them. Au contraire, those things are parables. All of them, all of it together is one giant parable for us to be able to see Jesus through the Bible. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, and at my churches, which I'm in right now, at least in one of them, I like to emphasize that the whole Bible is and always should be about Jesus. If you're a pastor listening to me right now and your preaching feels a little stale, something that I like to remind myself is it pointing people back to Jesus? Is it lifting Jesus up? And if you are going through a dry spell in your devotional time, you get up in the morning and you pray and you read a part of the scripture and you don't get anything out of it, ask yourself this one thing: am I making it about Jesus? Am I finding Jesus when I read the Bible? If the answer is no, then we're not doing it right. Jesus says that when we read the Bible and we don't see Jesus in it, then we're being foolish, just like the disciples going to Emmaus. So that's something that's, even though that is like a little bit of a rebuke in there, it's really encouraging to me because it reminds me that no matter how difficult the Bible might seem at the moment, or how boring it might seem, or how scary it might seem, the end goal that God has given us the Bible for is as one giant parable, story after story, that tells us about what Jesus is like. So that's my encouragement to you, that you would find flavor and find encouragement and passion for reading the Bible, because Jesus is in there waiting to be found. And sometimes he doesn't even wait. He will show himself to us, just like he did to those disciples going home after feeling defeated. So let me know if this was something new to you. Maybe it wasn't, and if it wasn't, great. I'm happy to know that you already knew this. If it is new to you and you want to share it with somebody, please share this with your friends, share this with your family, share it with anybody, because I wish that everybody would know that the Bible is absolutely replete. It's full of examples of Jesus. So that's all I wanted to share with you today. Again, that scripture for today was Hebrews chapter 9, verse 9, talking about how the sanctuary service and the tabernacle and the holy place, all of those things were a giant parable about Jesus. Friends, I'm Pastor Eli, and this has been A Faith Friday. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.